Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tina. I am the Capability Building Coordinator for Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand. Connecting Up is a not-for-profit organisation. Our purpose is to help fellow not-for-profits leverage the digital world to positively impact their communities. The digital world is expanding beyond IT software and hardware and digital marketing to new innovative service delivery and measuring social impact. Connecting Up believes that not-for-profits with the right tools and skills can and do achieve great things for their communities. We have a long history of affordable software, hardware, educational events, and group consulting. We partner with over 40 organisations to deliver high-quality products and services specifically meeting the unique needs of the not-for-profit sector. I'd like to welcome you all to the webinar series Cyber Risk, Part 1, which will be presented by Monica from Advisory Boards Group. We'll start with a little bit of housekeeping. All lines are muted, so if you have any technical issues or any questions during the session, please type it into the questions box on your webinar panel, and Monica will answer them in the Q&A section at the end of the webinar. Please note that your comments and questions will not appear to the entire group. If you are on a Wi-Fi connection and have multiple programs open, this can sometimes affect the quality of the audio and video of the webinar. If possible, please close all other programs to help you have the best experience possible today. Please note that the webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording and the slides will be sent out to you within 2 business days after the webinar ends. Before we start, I'd also like to remind you that there will be a short survey at the end of the webinar. We'd appreciate it if you took a few minutes to provide us with some feedback on today's webinar. That's all from me for now. I'll pass it over to Monica to get things started. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much, Tina, and thank you everyone for joining in this webinar. So today we're going to talk about the cyber risk. And we are going to talk about the cyber risk in the context of risk management in general. I'm a partner with the Advisory Boards Group, and we provide governance advice and educational courses for companies, not-for-profits and for-profits. So I'll start with the agenda. I split this agenda into 2 parts. The first one is the identification part, and the second one will actually be on how to manage, transfer, accept, or deal with these risks. So I think 3 main questions would be about who, how, and when to identify these risks. Quite often, in talking to boards of directors, in talking to managers or CEOs, I hear that, well, I don't think that's a board problem. The cyber risk is actually something that is, in the remit of the IT person, the IT manager. And I always respond that this is not the case. And the reason for that is that cyber risk, in particular, when it eventuates, can have devastating consequences for the company. And because of that, I think the cyber risk has to sit on the board agenda, and it has to be discussed at the board level. It doesn't mean that only the board has this responsibility. Everybody in the organization does have it. But in the world, in the connected world that we live in and we work in, we have to understand that it's everybody's problem, and the directors are liable for anything that happens to the company and can bring the company out of business. So I devised this sort of model where I'm discussing risk, and you don't see the cyber risk here, but I will explain where it actually sits. I like to treat risk and to think of managing risk in a pyramid style. So we are managing risks upwards. So the staff has to manage risks according to their delegated financial authority and delegated authority. And they have to pass the higher risks to the management. So if, for example, you're in charge of, your delegated authority is up to $1,000, you cannot manage a risk with respect to a contract that is worth $50,000 to the organization. You've got to escalate that risk to the next level of management. In the same way, the management has to escalate risks that they cannot manage to the CEO. And the CEO usually has a specific delegate authority, delegate financial authority, and every risk that is above and beyond what they are allowed to deal with has to be taken to the board of directors. The board has to put in place a risk strategy, which also includes the risk appetite. Are they happy to go with the risk? Are they happy to actually consider an opportunity? Because when you say risks, they are only the bad things, but you also have to look at the positive side, which are the opportunities. And also part of this risk management system, I also like to look at the issues. And the very clear distinction between risks and issues is that a risk has not eventuated whilst an issue has eventuated. There are some situations which are a bit more complex where you have a situation that has a risk associated and also an issue. But we are not going to go into that now. There is a clear distinction between the operational aspects and the strategic aspects. So what does the board do and what does the CEO and the entire organization do? And I listed here the duties the CEO and the organization have to deal with the implementation of a risk management system. They have to identify the risks and opportunities. They have to document them. They have to manage them. And reporting, update the risk register. So that's a vehicle to report and discuss the risks and actually demonstrate how you have changed the impact on the organization or the likelihood or the exposure the organization has. At the board level, the board must create this strategy for risks, and also they must manage the extreme risks and the very high risks. They can also appoint a risk management committee. The CEO can appoint a risk manager that can deal with these risks. Now, the composition of the risk management committee would probably be a risk manager, if you do have one. Otherwise, people from the executive team, perhaps the CEO, and always, I think you should invite a board director to be part of this committee. Even if you cannot solve all the issues, cannot mitigate all the risks at this level, at least you can take the extreme risks to the board with a number of proposed solutions, and then the board can make a call. So again, the cyber risk is something that is so extreme, so important, that it's a risk that can bring, when it eventuates, it can bring the entire organization down, and you've got to take it to the board of directors. How can we manage risks? I like this particular photo from 1990. It was the depiction of the World Wide Web. So just imagine that your network is a little speck in that network. How can you defend yourself against attacks from anywhere and anybody? And I think what is really important, it is scary when you look at it and you think like that. But what is important is that you build many defense lines. Because you have to be successful every time in defending the organization, whereas the hackers have to be successful only once to penetrate through your lines of defense. And you must understand that even if you're a very small company, you're still subject to cyber attacks. There were many cyber attacks that have been done by scanning the internet. WannaCry is one of them. And another example that I wanted to give you, last year, there was the Department of Defense had a project, a $1.5 billion project, which was attacked. So the files were exfiltrated by attacking a subcontractor, a mom and dad company, small company, which had only one IT guy that was 4 levels down from defense. So the hackers found the weakest link, they penetrated that company, and then through this subcontractor, they managed to exfiltrate the files. So wherever you are, it doesn't matter what size you have, you also have to think of your partners and stakeholders. And this is why I brought here, because there are many methodologies for risks, but I brought here the principles from the duty of care risk analysis, the DOCRA. So you can go to the DOCRA site and find these principles. I did not want to enlist the processes, but rather stay at the top of the pyramid of information. So these principles talk about the interests of all the parties that may be harmed by the risk. So think that it's not only your organization, and don't think that who would want to hack, a small company. Just think of all the stakeholders that you have, all the partners, and if even if you're a small organization, you may still be hacked, through scanning attacks or other methods. Your employees can actually click on a file that has malware and so on. If you have stakeholders, and obviously that are linked to you through contracts, through various relationships, you have to discuss with them the risks that you have. And perhaps you can enlist, if you're a small organization, you can actually enlist their help to see how you can protect the relationship, and you can protect your organization and their organization by working cooperatively together. In the US, they have a form of organizations called the ISACs, ISAC, and they created a specific ISAC for each industry, whereby people share this sort of information. And there is an ISAC, for example, for healthcare, and another one for manufacturing, and so on. For banking, they were quite successful in actually helping each other when the banks in the US had suffered attacks. And the last one, which is probably, this was legislated in America, I believe, since 1993, is that the safeguards must not be more burdensome than the risks they protect against. So obviously the judges have to consider that if you're protecting a risk that is, $2 million worth, you can't put in place a safeguard, or you're not expected to put in place a safeguard that is more than that. We are used to dealing probably more in Australia with the heat map, and there are two aspects of how you can actually quantify the risk when you assess it. You can use a quantitative method whereby the impact is, you measure it as 1 to 5, where 1 is really low, almost no impact, and 5 is catastrophic. And the likelihood, 1 is it may not happen at all, and 5 is it's almost certain that it will happen. Now, it's quite easy to use, and I actually like this quantitative method, because you simply multiply the exposure that a company can have is, let's say, 5, a likelihood of 5 times 1, which is the impact, that is a 5, and you're still in the green zone. When you have a 5 as a likelihood and 5 as the impact, catastrophic, then I think you really need to take that to the board of directors. So this is like an easy method to apply. Obviously, it's tricky to consider, what the impact could be. There are organizations that like to use the qualitative method, whereby you have like the likelihood can be, from unlikely to almost certain, and the impact can be from very low to high or extreme. Without having necessarily a preference, I think this one is easier to see. So when do we need to protect against cyber risks? And the answer is all the time, even when that's like a 24/7 mission. and you've got to have the systems in place that actually protect the organization where your employees are there or are not there. One of the malware types used quite often in our days is are malware and viruses that actually come and install miners, Bitcoin or other cryptocurrency miners on your computer. So in other words, they use your electricity and use your computers when you're not there. But regardless of the fact that they would do damage or not, you've got to protect yourself. So the question is, when can you manage the risk? And I think because obviously this has to be in the front of your mind, but you cannot deal, all the time, talk only about the risks. So you've got to start with the initial workshops for each department. And you've got to involve your teams, you've got to involve your executive teams, and then you've got to discuss the risk at the board level. The board has to be trained in risk methodology. I think everyone can think back of what happened with CBA, the Commonwealth Bank, and how they actually ignored risk and they have not treated it properly. I'm not speculating on what happened, but the report that was put out was quite frightening. There should be weekly discussions in the team meetings. And if there is a risk that is like an extreme risk, something really significant that occurs, don't wait for the end of the week when you have the weekly meeting and discuss. Just go and do something about it and talk to people about this risk. A risk management committee should be a committee reporting to the board. And as I mentioned and I suggested previously, this risk management committee should have a board member, should have the risk manager in the organization as members, and perhaps any other executives that may be or would be, interested and could bring information. Obviously, if you have, when you discuss the cyber risk, you've got to have the IT manager there. But cyber risk is not only the remit of the IT manager. You also have to think of the procurement department. You have to think what conditions you have in your contracts with your suppliers and your clients and how you're going to react if there is a cyber attack. You've got to you have to invite HR, look at the procedures and processes that you have for hiring, firing employees, confidentiality, and so on. You've got to look at the premises. You have to look at many other aspects when you deal with a cyber risk. One example that I wanted to give here, and this is what I created in an organization that where I'm the chair of the board, and I'm also the chair of this risk committee. I created the committee called Finance, Audit, Risk Management and Security. It's FARMS. Obviously, if the organization is larger, you need to split the function, and sometimes you can have finance and audit, then you can have risk management and security. So this is really up to you and what would you need to tailor to what you need. The board meetings, risk and cyber risk should be an item on the agenda. A few years ago, Target, a large organization in America, suffered this cyber attack, and the directors got off the hook because they were saying, well, we did have cyber risk on the agenda at every single board meeting. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that you should have it just as a sort of, a fake item on the agenda. The board really needs to look at it and needs to discuss it. And they need to also be aware of how they should react, how they should prepare, and the board has the obligation, in my view, to create a cybersecurity strategy. and really put their money where their mouth is to protect the organization. When we discuss about the cyber risks and how to identify them, there are various methodologies. So it is important that you establish a risk management system. So you look at the context, definitions, categories of risks, standards. And when I talk about standards, I think you have to start with the classical ISO 31000, which is the risk management standard. Some people like to refer back to the 4360, the ISO 4360, which was the previous one. And the community feels that this was a better standard. There will be a review of the 31000. You can also look in terms of cyber at the ISO 27005, which is for cybersecurity risk. And there are various other methodologies like the NIST, NIST publication 800-30. There is a risk IT framework provided by ISACA. COBIT is probably a more comprehensive methodology. I gave the example of the duty of care risk analysis standard, DOCRA, the 3 principles. And more closely to home in Australia, we have the ASIC Corporate Governance Council principles and recommendations, of which principle number 7 deals with risk. I don't particularly like how this principle number 7 deals with risk. I believe that there should be more accountability given to the board of directors, and these principles are currently under review. The reason why I'm saying that is that I come from a background of having been trained in project management and PMBOK, which means Project Management Book of Knowledge, which gives you like a solid risk training. There's also a difference that I wanted to make. If you look at all these methodologies, CISRAM, so CIS stands for Center for Internet Security and their risk assessment method, or NIST, Risk IT, even COBIT, consider the difference between the governance in the US, the models of governance at board level and the models of governance in Australia. I think we do have the TRICA model is a better model of governance versus what is in the US. And I think you all heard the example where Elon Musk has been asked to step down from his chairman position and to be only the CEO of the organization. So the governance actually means a separation of those two roles between governance and operational matters. When another aspect of identifying risks, when you identify risks, you've got to think of the maturity level of your organization, because obviously if you're a $100 million organization, you'll have in place certain processes versus if you have under 1 million in revenue per year. On the right-hand side, you've got the tier system, which is specific to CISRAM, and it comes from. So it actually defines the tiers as 1 to 4. 1 is partial, when the risk management process is informal and ad hoc. Then you go up to a tier 2, where the risk management process is informed. Then repeatable, a tier 3, and then adaptive. Personally, I prefer the CMMI model, which is on the left-hand side. CMMI stands for Capability Maturity Model of Integration, and where on level 1 you have almost no processes, you rely on your heroes, and on level 5 the processes are so good that you can run the company with robots. Now, that could be too costly or ineffective, so I always suggest that people try to aim for a level 3. So what I'm going to present to you now is the CIS RAM workbook. So it is from the Center for Internet Security. This is a document where I actually, it's a Creative Commons license, which means that I can use this for non-commercial purposes. So we cannot send it to you, but we will send you, Tina will send you the link. And I placed here the tier system because the model refers to this tier system. So if we look at the project plan, for example, this is a tier 1 organization. The tier 1 organization does not necessarily have good processes for risk. So this is something that could help you in thinking how you're going to deal with risk. Define the scope and scheduling, risk assessment criteria, risk assessment, then gather evidence, and so on. If you see here, you do not have the categories of risk. And the other issue with this model, again, because it is an American model, you do not have the board having a role in this, and yet the board can be liable for breaches, data breaches, for security breaches, and so on. Only recently, you must be aware, I mean, not recently, in February this year, we had the data breach notification bill introduced, whereby companies that are subject to the Privacy Act must report on the breaches. For a tier 2, there's not much difference. So a tier 2 organization is a bit more advanced. Then you look at the scope, and the scope has, I'll just try to magnify it a bit so that you see better. So you look at the asset types where you have the information, intellectual property, and private information, personal information. And you see the business owner, the CEO, so you have to define who the business owner is. Similarly, you look at the criteria for a tier 1 organization, provide information to help. This was just an example. This was for a hospital and template for exercise. So you have to start with defining the organization's mission, describe a scenario where it would be acceptable or unacceptable. And again, you see the way of, the method of actually classifying that risk, the exposure. So you take the threshold that is acceptable in terms of impact times the threshold for likelihood, which would give 2 times 2 equals 4. Therefore, an acceptable risk is lower than 4. A risk register then ends up looking like this, which is a bit complex. So you don't necessarily need to take something like that and apply it to your organization. You have to tailor it. So you look at the family, you look at the syscontrol, the subcontrols, the title, description, the information asset. Data as an asset cannot have, unfortunately, cannot have a value placed on it in the balance sheet unless you can sell that as a database. Yet breaching that data or losing it can have dire consequences. So that's where the accounting standards are yet to catch up with what's happening in IT. So you look at the vulnerability, the threat, the likelihood, mission impact, and so on. I always like to see in a risk system, in a risk register, I always like to see the history of how this particular risk was treated. So we are going to give you the link to where you can find this template. We got close to the end of this session, so I would like to invite you, if you have any further questions, you can email us. You can email Tina. These are the contacts. The Advisory Boards Group offers cybersecurity workshops. We can help you implement cyber risk and risk management systems, and we also have directors and officers cyber courses and cybersecurity health checks. And that is the where we actually got the information and the images. Thank you so much for listening in today. Tina, is back to you now if you have any questions.
Thanks, Monica. We do have a comment from Rob, who has said, for part 2, maybe cyber attacks change their vectors from time to time and new attack vectors arise that were previously unknown. How do you estimate the risk level for an as yet unknown attack vector? How do you estimate the dollar value of the risk related to that unknown attack vector?
Thank you for the question. I think this is it's a cat and mouse game. And there are, when you actually get, let's say, an antivirus system, which is obviously not enough, you must have, or you should have an IDS/IPS, intrusion detection and intrusion protection system in your organization. These companies constantly refer back to huge databases. They don't necessarily have to use their own databases of malware, but they can actually use that as a service. So they pay a license to get access to these databases. And then they constantly send updates. So when you have an IDS/IPS system, intrusion detection, intrusion protection, then the system will constantly match something that is odd, a conversation or a dialogue on your network that is not something that happens usually, against that particular database. And that's how you can actually catch them. So large security firms that create these IDS/IPS systems and create these databases, they actually constantly look not only at what's happening, but they also look at the dark web and these, I call them supermarkets, the markets where the hackers can buy the tools. So they constantly scan, what's happening. And quite often they put honeypots. Honeypot is something to attract the hackers, just so that they can study and see the hacker, and the hacker doesn't know that they're actually being watched there. Obviously, nothing in the world can protect you against every single attack. But I think the more vigilant you are, and the more, how can I say, proactive you are, because you can't rely only on technology. You also have to put in place processes. You have to have a business continuity plan, and you have to know how to survive an attack. I think the better a chance you have to stay successful, to be successful, to stay in business. So yeah, I would say just use a system that is a similar, an IDS/IPS system. They take care of that. You've got to take care of processes and having a BCP in place, as well as the educational side of things, to actually let your employees and teach your employees and your board and your management how to protect themselves against various attacks.
So Rob says he understands, but how do you estimate the impact of a successful attack? That was a necessary condition in the methodology in order to promote the risk to a correct level, for example, up to the board or not.
How do you estimate the risk? Well, I can give you one example. There was a company, that got hacked within the space of and got completely taken under in the space of 2 weeks. So what sort of value do you put on that? This was Distribute.IT. It was a domain service provider that had 33,000 clients. They got hacked, and within 2 weeks they disappeared off the face of the earth. You can calculate the risk, and sometimes so you actually think of, and there are methods to calculate the risk. You say, well, if we get hacked, this would be the impact that we would have. So let's say we would actually lose $10,000. That could be the value of 3-4 laptops that can be hacked. Then you calculate the rough probability, the occurrences. So if that can happen 2-3 times a year, then you have $20,000-$30,000, and then you go to the board and say, well, we would like to put in place a measure that would cover against this specific loss, and that would cost X, and that X would actually cost less than the exposure that you would have. Does that address Rob's question? So there is the method of calculating is you can find that in the NIST and also in COBIT.
Okay, hope that addresses your question, Rob. He says, agreed, thanks. So we don't have any other questions. So is there anything that you wanted to add, Monica?
I would say I would like to remind everybody before we close this call that there are 3 main drivers in this industry. The cybersecurity industry is growing at a rapid pace, and it is growing because of 3 drivers. One, the crooks, the criminals, find this industry a low entry industry, and they can, without having a lot of knowledge, just investing a little bit of money, they can buy tools or hire tools, and they can go on attack. So it's a way of living, a way of making money. The second driver that is pushing the industry is the regulation, which is becoming tougher and tougher. So we've seen in Australia the introduction of the mandatory data breach notification. In Europe, there is the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, which is much tougher than our laws in Australia. And probably the third driver would be the lawyers that are actually trying to help their clients ramp up and launch class action if their data gets breached. So given these 3 drivers, the industry is growing, and I think as directors, as officers, as executives, we need to really be aware and try to protect ourselves. So I think these are my closing words for today, Tina.
Great. Thank you, Monica, for presenting today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I hope you've all learned a lot from this presentation and that your questions have been answered. If you do have any questions that come to mind later or any feedback at all, please send that through to events@connectingup.org and we'll answer those questions offline. You can also contact Monica directly via the information on the slide deck, which will be emailed through to you later on this afternoon. Don't forget that the recording will be available within 2 business days and a link will be sent to you via email, so keep an eye out on your inbox. Again, thank you for being with us. Enjoy the rest of your day and we look forward to seeing you all next week for part 2. Thanks, Monica. Thanks, everyone.